Hello, welcome to this video. We're going to be covering the issues of complicated grief and mourning and crisis and trauma. I'm Jennifer Cisney, and I'll be covering the area of crisis and traumatic stress. I specialize in helping people within the first 24 to 72 hours after a traumatic event. I'm trained in something called critical incident stress management, and we'll be speaking more about that.
And I'm Frida Cruz. I am a licensed professional counselor in the state of South Carolina. I've been in practice for more than 20 years, and one of the areas of great interest for me has been the area of grief, because each and every situation that is brought into my counseling office involves loss of some kind. It can be what we call a small death or a small loss, or it can be a real death, and that, of course, brings on what we know as grief. Grief is an emotional response to loss. So I'm going not to be talking about the basics of just normal grief, but the purpose of my presentation is going to be to talk about complicated grief. There isn't a line that we can draw in the sand that says, and I would call it the therapeutic sand, that says if you step over this line, it's complicated grief. In fact, it's a very difficult line to define between normal grief and complicated or even a pathological grief. But I'm going to attempt to define a line in general that says, so that a therapist or a helper can know when a client or a helpee possibly has crossed that line from normal grief and mourning to complicated grief and mourning.
Dr. Cruz, we're going to start out by letting me interview you on your topic of complicated grief. First, let me ask you, you talked about both grief and mourning. Can you help me understand the difference between grief and mourning?
Of course, various people define it differently and separate the two differently, Jennifer. But it's easier for me to understand in thinking of grief as being the emotional response to loss, and mourning being the behavioral response. And very often, it's when we think of the grief process, mourning is something that goes on for a good period of time. All right, think of the widow that used to wear the black for 1 year in mourning. That will help you, help understand the difference. Grief comes on usually very early with the emotions, or it should, normal grief. And of course, we're going to be talking about if that doesn't happen, that is going to be abnormal. So grief is more emotional, and mourning, I see it as more behavioral.
That makes a lot of sense to me. First of all, if I'm a people helper or a counselor, how do I know the difference between the normal stages of grief and complicated grief? What is complicated grief, and what does it look like?
And you're asking a very complicated question. Therapists wrestle with this all the time, and it isn't something that I can just say in black and white that this is normal and this is abnormal. What I do like to say is that early on, just about anything is normal. When someone has experienced a significant loss, and especially by death or divorce, I find that grief following a separation or divorce can be very intense, and it can be very similar to loss by death. So very often I'll refer to divorce as well as death. But it's significant loss, and one has experienced that. Early on, we don't want to tag anything hardly as abnormal. But one thing we can look for, and that would be what we call psychotic behavior or psychotic symptoms, even early on. Then that would probably signal that we're into something abnormal. But other than that, we expect people to behave in an abnormal way.
Now, when you say psychotic symptoms, that would mean someone who has really lost touch with reality.
Yes. For instance, they're in such denial, and their behavior says that they are not willing to accept the death or the loss, and they act as if it hasn't happened. I can think of an example years ago in my hometown when a doctor in our town, his son was killed out in a hunting accident, and as people visited during the early days before the funeral and so forth, when they would get to the house, he would invite them in, and I've forgotten the boy's name, but he would say, "Sit down, Johnny's taking a shower, or Johnny's in the back, he'll be here just any time." Well, don't we know right away that they're not in touch with reality?
Right, and that's a big warning sign.
That's a big warning sign.
But for most people, the complicated grief may not show up that soon. You said anything is normal in the beginning. So when do we start to look for signals that this may be complicated and a person may not be moving through the grief process normally?
We look at the duration of their behavior, and we look at the intensity of their behavior. Those two things can give us some signals. I can remember that a family called me about their mom. Her spouse, their father, had died, and it had been about 2 years. And she was not what they thought coming out of it or making forward movement in the grief process. And they called and talked with me about it and asked if I would see her, and I agreed to. And immediately I knew, even though we can't put a timeline, Jennifer, on anybody's grief, and we can't say that 3 years is abnormal. It isn't for some people, but it was 2 years, but there were some signs that told me that it was abnormal grief that I was dealing with, and that was that she was still, after 2 years, visiting the grave every day. Now that's pretty common early on, but what we usually want to do is guide them away from doing that, for the rest of their lives. And she was withdrawing. That's one of the symptoms. She wasn't getting involved in any community activities. Even the people from her church, she was not allowing herself to receive support from support groups, and her family they were really worried about her. She could not talk about the deceased. She was obsessed with her loss and with the deceased, and these are some symptoms then that you gather with grief that we would tag, as it were, or refer to as complicated. So that's kind of like an example out of my case files.
That makes a lot of sense. What are some of the other symptoms, both behavioral symptoms, maybe cognitive or physiological symptoms that we may see as warning signs of complicated grief?
Well, let's look at let's look at the emotional, the behavioral, psychological, even some spiritual things, and also the physiological. Another case that comes to my mind is that a woman had lost her son in a tragic automobile accident, and for a while she seemed to be going along okay with the grief process, and I didn't hear from her for a while, and the next time I heard from her, she was doing quite well. And I thought, well, she's progressing nicely then in the grief journey. But what she immediately started complaining about that was this terrible pain in her legs. And that's called conversion. So a person very often will take their grief, and rather than dealing with it and feeling it so they can heal from that grief, they will convert it into a physical symptom, something that they can identify and say, this is where I hurt. And she had actually converted her grief pain into a physical pain. So that's some physiological symptoms. Other physiological symptoms have to do with sleep disturbance, sexual disturbances, even food. Some begin to eat more and start gaining weight. Some eat less or have no appetite. Some want to sleep all of the time. Others won't sleep at all, have insomnia. Then you look at the psychiatric situations that you look for, such as a deep clinical depression, suicidal ideations, and I'm probably not just laying these out as to where they fit. They're just all kind of pouring in, and I'm putting them out. And the suicidal ideations, that can come on very early, and that's something that a therapist or a helper needs to look for, because so very often the survivor wants to join the person that has died. I remember a 16-year-old girl that her boyfriend was killed in an automobile accident, and every day early on she would go to the cemetery, lie down by his grave, and stay there for maybe hours at the time, just sobbing her heart out. And she really, her mom came to me for counseling as to find out what to do with her daughter. She was so concerned, and so then she would cry and sob at the grave, and her mom discovered that she was literally wanting to die to be with her boyfriend, and that's not an uncommon experience at all. But it isn't something that we want to allow to continue for a long period of time.
All of those certainly sound like warning signs and symptoms that we would be aware of. What causes someone to get to that place where they start to behave that way? What causes complicated grief?
And I'm going to call it, this doesn't mean it's bad for people to experience complicated grief. It has nothing to do with the person, but to help persons understand, especially therapists and helpers. I've come up with a couple of acrostics. So when we think of complicated grief, let's go with bad. That's bad grief. There's a good grief and there's a bad grief, and we'll talk about both. So for the bad, let's go with the B, having to do with our beliefs and our behaviors. If we have been taught that, especially as Christians, that we are not to grieve or express our grief, and some church communities, as it were, they don't allow for this. They don't give the person permission to grieve, because as a Christian you're supposed to be strong, but it's interesting that Paul, in giving those instructions about grief, he didn't say that as Christians we're not to grieve. He said we were not to grieve as those that are not Christians, as those that have no hope, as it were. So we have to look at a client or a helpee's beliefs to see what beliefs are behind the behavior that's inhibiting the grief process, that's keeping them from early full grieving, which of course is a healthier or a good grief.
So one question would be, does this person seem to give themselves permission to grieve? Are they comfortable with the fact that they are in a grieving process?
And that's one of the first things you will find with persons that are experiencing complicated grief, especially if they come from the Christian community. Very often either their culture or their church community or their tradition, something is inhibiting their grief, and it's coming from their beliefs or what they've been taught or what they've been informed about the grief process.
Can that also be something that we learn from our families, how we've watched other people grieve?
Definitely. It can be modeled for us. And especially men maybe yet aren't given the freedom to cry or weep openly or to grieve. And of course, some cultures would not allow for it, and some families, have to put on that. That's another thing that we look for, is that stoic look, that, where there can be just the failure, the refusal to let anybody know that I'm weak, that I can't handle this. Somehow or other, we're a society that we're supposed to be able to handle anything.
I think a warning sign for that might be if someone has had a tremendous loss and you ask them how they're doing and they say fine. Yes,
that's exactly right. And as a therapist, by the way, or a helper, I would want to stop them right then and get them to define fine for me. And also, their language can betray them, as it were. If you can tell that they're very depressed or they're very unhappy, but at the same time they're telling you they're fine, you know that you've got a dissonance there, you've got a disintegration maybe that's going on that you have to look for.
So what we may need to do with these people who are having these problems with accepting their grieving process is notice the external signs, because they may not be reaching out to say they're in trouble. We may have to identify that.
Yes, and they actually, again, might think that would say they're weak, or that they're not doing as well, I think it's unrealistic expectations. I think that's what I'm looking for, Jennifer. that they can be placed on a grieving person. Another belief, I think, can come from the grieving person themselves, and that is an unrealistic expectation about life. That, in other words, God, why has God allowed this? This shouldn't have happened to me. Or even a narcissistic, sense of entitlement that it's okay if it happens to others, but God should not have allowed this in my life. Or just not facing the fact that life is very unpredictable, at times very unfair, and yes, that there are going to be losses throughout our life. Loss is something that none of us can escape. And to grieve our losses is normal, and to fail to grieve our losses is abnormal.
Now, those are the behavioral and belief causes behind the complicated or bad grief. What about some of the other causes?
Attachments makes up for the A, and we've already touched on that a little bit, coming from the family of origin. Attachment injuries are being wounded in our early attachments, and when we refer to attachments, we're referring to those persons that we look to take care of us early on in life, and how they cared for us or how they didn't care for us is going to play a role in how we grieve our losses. Also, persons can be what we call dependent persons, and if they are dependent on their spouse for everything and they lose that spouse, the grief process is probably going to become complicated for that person unless there's early intervention, of course, which you can be talking about later. That early intervention would be so very important when we know that that person is a dependent person, and now suddenly they've got to look out for themselves, and fear sets in, anxiety sets in, and they would want to deny the loss at that point.
So basically, whether we are really strongly and maybe overly attached to people and dependent on them in our lives, or maybe if our attachments are really distant and loose and we can't acknowledge the importance of people in our lives, either of those could lead to complicated grief.
That, and whether or not our attachment figures or objects that we attach to were reliable, what can happen in a grief process. And I learned this as a therapist, and this was just a big eye-opener for me, that very often a person, again, because of their beliefs or what they've learned, they will refuse to handle their losses, grieve their losses. They're what we call small deaths as they go along, and they tuck them away. But then if a big loss comes along, like the death of someone very significant and close to them, it allows them then to have reason to grieve. They can attach it to something, and what happens, all the ungrieved things and losses hop out, and they're handling it all at once. So I call it Pandora's box. It opens Pandora's box, and grief can do that. And another thing that can happen is that there can be other manifestations, such as I have found persons that have failed and are refused to grieve their losses can end up with panic attacks. That's one of the things that was amazing about grief, was that a panic disorder can come out of unresolved grief.
I've heard people use that old phrase, pay me now or pay me later, that eventually all the losses in our life, all the grief work has to be done. You can pretend like you're not going to do it or stuff it down or store it away, but one of these days you're going to have to deal with it.
And that is so true of grief. I refer to it as the satisfaction of grief. It demands that you grieve, and it's not going away until it is totally satisfied with the payment that you've made in grieving. And again, that plays into complicated grief, because if persons cut that off, refuse to allow grief to have its way, as it were, with them, then grief is just going to be pounding away at that door to let me in, recognize me, pay me, I want to be satisfied, and I'm not going to let you go. Actually, grief can get a death grip emotionally and psychologically on someone, and even literally with those that choose suicide as a way of handling their grief. So we as therapists and helpers, when we're looking to intervene, we want to give that picture to grieving people, that grief is saying, if you'll take care of me, if you'll satisfy me, I'll let you go.
Now, Dr. Cruz, what about the D in bad grief?
Death. Of course, we're talking about death, whether we're talking about the death of a marriage, you know, the death of a relationship. But when we think of death being permanent, you know, a literal death, then that's the most permanent kind of loss, and usually produces the most significant or intense form of grief. Except, as I noted before, divorce can bring a very intense grief, and other losses can bring intense grief. But Jennifer, we have to look at the characteristics of the death, whether it was anticipated, whether it was a sudden, and you know as well as I know that a sudden death, a sudden loss brings on a more intense grief when it's unexpected. We also have to look at if they've experienced previous losses and how they handled those losses, how many deaths were involved. You know that sometimes they're just like this family recently from Atlanta, a whole family almost wiped out in an airplane crash in Africa. Well, there are some family members left, but think of losing 14 members of your family at one time. So when you look at the characteristics, suicide survivors experience a very unique and painful grief because there can't be closure. They can't get that question answered, why? Same can be when it's like a traumatic event that you'll be talking about, like murder. My own brother had a son that was murdered at the age of 19, and there can't be that closure that needs to come, you know, with a loss such as these kinds of deaths.
I can think of several examples as you're speaking when I have worked with people after traumatic events, that the way there was the death, whether it was particularly painful, that they were particularly hurt by how their loved one died or how their life was taken, where there was some violence involved, or whether they didn't have closure because maybe there was never a body. Maybe they didn't have that. Also, another issue is I have seen, particularly when there's a loss of a young person or a child that was taken in an untimely way, that seems to be complicated. Is that the case?
Definitely. I remember a client that it was complicated grief, and she lost a daughter, a 16-year-old daughter, in a tragic automobile accident. But what really complicated her grief, and so we'll go back to another cause for it, her daughter had been depressed over a period of several weeks or months, and she thought she was helping her daughter. I don't think she had sought medical help for her. She just thought she would, as a teenager, she would come out of it. And so she finally persuaded her daughter, who was withdrawing from social events and her friends and so forth, to go out with this particular friend on a Friday night. She thought that it would cheer her daughter up and that would be good for her. And her daughter did not want to go, but her mother persuaded her to go on this Friday night with this particular friend. And the friend picked her up, and within 5 minutes of leaving the home, she was dead. Her friend had run off the road, hit a tree, and the daughter was not wearing a seatbelt, and she was killed instantly. And so you know that she was set up with all of the guilt that she was carrying. She felt totally responsible for her daughter's, you know, death. So she definitely went into a complicated grief process, and it was a very long time that I was working with her and the whole family, because let's just go ahead and say it doesn't just affect the person that's experiencing the complicated grief, it affects the whole family. There were 2 more children involved, and they ended up in my office also, and one day they said very upfront with their mom, "Mom, are you not aware that we are alive? That we need you as a mother? She is dead, she is gone." And sometimes, Jennifer, that's what it takes to break a grief process in intervention. We need our clients and our helpees beginning to be able to say, and that's where the acceptance comes in, that's where our helping them with the intervention process and the treatment program, being able to say, Jennifer, or we refer to, her name, Jennifer is dead. Jennifer is dead, Mom. We need you.
Now, you're talking about then how to help people intervene in this process of bad grief. That probably takes us to good grief. And what does it look like to intervene and help people grieve in a healthy way?
Well, the first word is grief. That's for the G. And as I've already alluded to, early full grieving is healthy grieving. So if we can encourage people, give them permission to grieve, if our community, our society can learn to give people permission to grieve, to claim their own grief process, to allow them to be very unique in the ways that they choose to grieve, even unique in the rituals, the funeral rituals that they choose, the rituals that they follow early on after the grief, as long as it stays within a normal, what we would say, a normal range. But early on, we even have to allow, and that's where some family members come in, and they can't allow for some abnormalities early on. Usually, they want them to grieve and get over it and start moving on far too quickly. So we would, the G standing for, to heal it, you've got to feel it, for one, to give themselves permission to grieve how they want to grieve, how they feel like grieving, having to do with experiencing the loss, whatever it is.
That sounds a lot like just giving them the freedom to do what they need to do to take care of themselves during that time, and to feel their feelings and to say, that's a normal part of what you're supposed to do.
Just like you put your approbation on it, give them permission that what you're experiencing at this point is very normal. There's something about all of us wanting to feel like what we're doing is normal. Of course, you question sometimes what normal is, but that's a very good way of normalizing it as you've referred to it.
What about our first O?
The O has to do with the old life. We have to, the client or the helpee, the grieving person has to come to terms with the fact that with the loss of this person and even the loss of the marriage, their life changes. The old life as it was, it's gone. Whether they wanted it to be or not, it is gone. That is reality. And so we must be there to encourage them to accept that and to embrace their new life, as it were.
Now, I can see that related to a lot of grief issues, of course, when there's a death, but also, like you said, divorce. What about loss of your health, loss of a job, moving, and loss of your community and your church and your friends? All of those can be dealt with if you accept that the old life is gone and you have a new normal, as it were.
And Jennifer, I think what helps with that so much is I think we're afraid of the new. Anytime we move out of something old, at least how it's comfortable there. And when we think of risking moving into something new, it can be very scary. And so you can think of all the many situations that it would be scary for someone that's moving from an old way of life into a new way of life. But what we want to do is offer hope and help them see it as a challenge, and that it could hold great potential. I mean, it could be the time to pursue dreams that were long ago forgotten. It could be the time to go back and get that education that one wishes they would have done and it was stopped short. It can be the time to develop new skills, and we move right into the next O, which has to do with a new self. Not only do we have to accept the reality that an old life has gone and we take on a new life, but the old self has to go and we take on a new self. We embrace that new self with a new identity, new roles. Maybe I'm going to be the breadwinner in the family. Maybe I'm no longer Mrs. So-and-so. I am now, say, Frida Cruz or Jennifer Sisney. I'm not the wife of so-and-so. And also, as sad as it is, and some use it differently. Yes, I am still the parent of this child, this son or daughter that I lost. But then there is the task of letting them go, which most people are afraid to. They feel guilty if I even think in terms of letting them go. But when we think of just taking the energy that we're investing in the lost person and reinvesting it, as it were, in the task ahead, rather than letting go. Sometimes it takes away that fear. But we never lose them, Jennifer, because we have the memories. So we bring them back, as it were. We let them go in one way, and we bring them back into our lives in our memories.
It sounds to me like both of those O's, getting rid of the old life and the old self, moving into new areas of the new life and the new self, would require tremendous faith. This is where the Christian faith in God really is important.
Yes. Believing that He is able to see us through any process, knowing that He has allowed it for some purpose, and then the question why, which is going to be there, changing that to what? What would God have me learn from this? What would God have come out of this for me? Where would He send me as a result of this? And we could come up with just many, many examples where that has happened, and we don't have time in this presentation. But yes, and then just trusting God, just trusting that He would not have allowed it. Being a loving, powerful, omnipotent, all-knowing God, He would not have allowed it had He not had a purpose in mind to accomplish in and through this event in our lives.
Now, the D in our good grief is for the same thing as the D in our bad grief, which is death. How is it different?
How is it different? It has to do with intervention and treatment and getting beyond. It has to do with accepting the reality of the death. We've talked about how it can lead to complicated grief. But that death has to be accepted as a reality. One cannot cling forever to their denial. Denial has to go at some point, and the pain of that loss has to set in. So the reality has to set in. Also, I think looking beyond that, as Christians, the hope that we have of life after death, that Ecclesiastes refers to there's a time to mourn, and there's a time to weep, but it also says there's a time to laugh, and there's a time to dance. And we may not get to, and we can laugh again. Actually, we need to give them permission to laugh again, to dance again with joy about other things, maybe new grandchildren coming into their lives, or graduation, or the marriage of another child. They need to be able to go back and rejoin life. It's a new life, but yet there's still some of the old there that can come forward, and there can be times of laughter and times of dancing. But then we have the future as Christians to look forward to, when there's going to be much laughter and much dancing, and especially when we're rejoined, as with that lost person, when we know that they've gone to be with the Lord and they're already laughing and dancing. We can look forward to the time that God tells us in Revelation that the tears are all going to be wiped away and all pain is going to be gone, and that there is going to be that great eternal time of laughter and dancing.
Oh, that's such an important concept. And Dr. Cruz, I think now we might move into just talking about trauma and crisis a little bit. So much of what you have talked about with complicated grief really connects to what I do when I work with people who have experienced crisis or traumatic events. But we're usually talking about intervening in those very early stages after a traumatic event to help prevent the complicated grief that you were talking about and some of those issues.
And Jennifer, even with just the normal grief process, I think getting there early on, and that's what we're doing actually with this video, helping educate people so that they do their work early on rather than it going over that line, wherever that line is. So how do you go about with early intervention, as it were, to bring this prevention about?
Well, in the whole field of critical incident stress management, crisis response, working with people after traumatic events, early intervention is absolutely key. Like you said, we say that you really need to start working with people within the first 24 to 72 hours after a trauma has happened. Because
would you define trauma, and would you define the kinds of incidences that you're referring to?
Yes. A critical incident or a traumatic event really is about the perspective of the individual. However, we usually say it's whenever something happens that makes someone fear for their own life, that they're in the presence of or witness something that completely undermines their sense of safety, and that they see something that doesn't normally happen, that isn't expected to happen. And it really is key that it undermines their sense of safety and well-being and makes their very life and their health feel threatened.
It's like suddenly the rug is just snatched right out from under them and they're afloat in a world of an unknown world, right?
That's exactly right. We think of trauma on the largest scale as something like the terrorist attacks that happened on September 11th, 2001, what happened at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and that would be the extreme. But people experience traumatic events every day in their lives. There are acts of workplace violence. There are acts of domestic violence, people that are attacking, killing each other. The school shootings that we've seen that are so prevalent in the news, those are traumatic events. Natural disasters.
War like we have going on.
Absolutely.
I just heard where 2 more of our men were killed this morning on the news, and you know, those families, and even for the men that are fighting there with them, that has to be traumatic.
It's terribly traumatic. Whenever people die by violent means, and that can mean at the hand of someone else who's perpetrated an act of violence, or that can mean, like I said, a natural disaster, that fires, floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, all of those things can cause tremendous trauma when something happens unexpectedly and people are injured or wounded. Traffic accidents, like you mentioned when you were talking about complicated grief, something that we don't expect that suddenly and violently attacks our safety and our well-being. Those are traumatic events.
Jennifer, I'm going to draw on your expertise in asking this question, because when persons are experiencing flashbacks that come with post-traumatic stress disorder, or they're reliving the event, and of course we know that goes along with trauma and traumatic events, something has happened that brings on this abnormal behavior, and actually something goes on in the brain to cause this kind of behavior, doesn't it?
It does, and actually the initial process after a trauma is actually something that is normal in the early stages. God created us so wonderfully. He made us so that something happens when we are in danger. When we experience a traumatic event, something happens in the brain, and our basic reasoning and functioning, our cognitive abilities that allow me to sit and process and weigh things out and make logical decisions, that gets disconnected for a very good reason. If our life is threatened and we have a flood, or somebody is shooting a gun at us, or a building is crashing down around us, we don't have time to sit and weigh our options and think through things cognitively. We then suddenly are pushed into our flight or fight response that you've heard of. The adrenaline shoots through our body, our cognitive reasoning is disconnected, and we revert back to this instinct to save myself, to flee. And so our more primal instincts that God put in there to keep us safe says, run, protect yourself, go. You know, take care of yourself for safety. But what happens after a trauma is that sometimes if you're not really careful to help people get back into the place of normal cognitive functioning, restore their sense of safety, they stay stuck in that flight or fight response. And so the brain is not functioning normally after a trauma. That's something we have to be very aware when we're walking in to work with people after a crisis or a traumatic event. They're not going to think rationally. They may not behave rationally because they're not functioning like they normally would.
Even in normal grief, I've visited people early on, and I'm thinking of a person right now that had lost a young young son, and you can see that glaze, over their eyes. You know that they're not in touch, totally in touch with. They know on some level what has happened, but it hasn't really hit them yet. What has happened. I think, being an airplane pilot, as you're describing this, I'm thinking of it being on automatic pilot. It's just like our bodies go on automatic pilot. And that's a gift from God to a point, isn't it?
It absolutely is a gift from God. We were designed that way by our Creator to help us be safe and protected. But what we need to realize then is once the immediate danger is gone, once we've gotten that person away from the fire or flood, that they're out of the danger zone, how do we restore them to normal functioning? Because sometimes that's what post-traumatic stress disorder is. It's the difference between post-traumatic stress is a normal response to an abnormal event. When we're threatened or we're in danger, something traumatic happens, it's normal for us to have all these symptoms and respond that way. But we need to be careful to help people start to, over a period of days and perhaps weeks, adjust to normal functioning again when their safety is restored. Some people will get stuck in that, and they will sense that, or their body and mind will function like that danger is present, even when they're perfectly safe. That's when it becomes post-traumatic stress disorder. We've heard of that with Vietnam veterans, men who come back from the war, and even though the war is over and they're safely at home with their families, they still feel and react like they're in that war zone, that they're still in danger. It's very real to them. They'll have that startle response. They isolate, they withdraw, they start to have a lot of those normal post-traumatic stress symptoms, but they have them when they're safe and in a place that's very removed from the danger.
Alrighty, where do we start, Jennifer, in intervening? Because you've come now and met me at the same point with complicated and sometimes even referred to as pathological grief. So we've kind of come together now. And so what would be your first step in intervening?
Well, we kind of have some areas that we can intervene that are real common that you can use, whether you're a trained professional going in or whether you're working with someone in a church setting, just working through some grief issues. Let me make the distinction that if you're going to do crisis response, meaning walking in to work with people immediately after a disaster, you do need to have specialized training. But we're going to take some of those principles from my specialized training and kind of generalize those to all types of trauma and grief situations that any of us can do to help people, some general principles. The first thing that we do is help people talk about what happened. And in our debriefing treatment, which is one of the interventions that we do, the very first thing we do is, where were you and what were you doing? Tell me your story about what happened. And we're trying to really get the facts from them. Part of what we're trying to do is restore that cognitive functioning, make them go back into talking about details, because memory loss and being real foggy on the details and not thinking clearly is a part of any kind of traumatic event, or probably you see that in grief as well.
That's true, but when I'm thinking about you talking in complicated grief, that's early on that you're talking about. And then if I think of long-term complicated grief, there are times when I have to take the opposite approach and get the person to stop talking about the deceased. So you can see how complicated the whole grief process can be. So we have to find where that person is. Are they doing enough talking? Are they talking too much? Are they doing enough weeping, which we encourage, or are they weeping too much? So there again, it has to do, and how long has it been with what you're talking, and with the veterans or with someone with PTSD, even abortion. You and I talked about this off of not doing the video. We have found that women that have abortions often don't experience any grief in the process till years later, and suddenly here comes, you know, the replay and the guilt and everything just piles in on them, and they go into this complicated mourning or the PTSD.
That's right. And so what we do try to do very early on in the early stages is help people talk about it. Talking about it early on will mean they don't necessarily have to talk about it all the time. Later, they get it out. They start, it helps them process and their brains start to function. And then we also want them to talk about their emotional reactions to it. Sometimes people...
How do you feel?
That's exactly
What
right.
are you feeling?
What are you feeling? What is your reaction? Some of the questions that we use are, what was the worst part of this for you? What part of it, if without changing the outcome or the consequences, what part of it would you erase? What was the most difficult? So getting at that emotional feeling reaction.
I was just talking with someone recently that's going through a very painful divorce, and the question that I posed as they were describing their pain was, what is it about it that is hurting the most? And it just opens up a whole flood of feelings. But when they have to think about where I'm hurting the most or how I'm hurting the most, or to define their pain, it helps a whole lot.
Oh, those are such perfect questions, and you're right. It really does help people get it out, so to speak. And I like to think of it as, if you have a wound, what do you do to help that wound heal? The first thing you do is you have to clean out the wound and get the debris and the dirt out and kind of open it up. And so that's really what we're doing. We're opening up the wound so that then it can heal cleanly.
I can see where this just doesn't even have to be a traumatic event, a traumatic death, and in some sense all deaths do carry some trauma with them, but you're carrying over even, and it could apply to the complicated grief. So we've kind of come together again, even in our intervention. What about, I use letter writing, because the deceased is gone, so I encourage the person that can't let them go or can't get a forward movement going in the process to write a letter to the deceased or go to the grave and visit them and talk to them. And some people have said, that's crazy, and even the client very often will say, well, what if somebody sees me standing out there at the grave talking? And I said, you know, don't worry about it. Because if it's helping you, that's what we're concerned about, is helping you. We know that person is not there. We do know their body is there, and that's all we have, and all they have at that point. So I have found that letter writing, even putting their resentments out, their anger out, it's like talking, like you're talking about. Letter writing, visiting the grave. What would you do? How would you follow up on that with your trauma?
Well, it's absolutely what you said, and that is giving people permission to feel what they feel and express that. And that means if it's anger, if it's sadness, if it's hopelessness, saying
which always
guilt,
comes into
absolutely,
the picture.
So much survivor
Why wasn't
guilt.
I there, you know? Why did I do this? Why did I do this? How come I, you know?
In traumatic events, survivor guilt is one of the #1 things that we see people face. Why did that person die and I live? Why was I in the right place? They were in the wrong place. A lot of those issues. But all of it is about letting people get that out and not making them feel bad for any of their feelings, but saying, express what you're feeling, because all of this, any of those feelings, are a normal part of this reaction for a period of time. Like you were saying, for a period of time, it's normal. And we like to say anywhere from about 30 days to 6 weeks with a traumatic event. And that moves us into kind of the third area that we start to take people in after a trauma, which is normalizing what they're going through. So important to tell them what you're experiencing, the physical, the emotional, the cognitive symptoms are a normal part of a reaction to a traumatic event. You're having a normal reaction to a very abnormal thing that occurred in your life. An analogy that I love to use about what we're doing in this educational process is, what if you had never had a cold virus or a flu? Ever in your life, you'd never had that happen, and you didn't even know what it was. And all of a sudden you started having these symptoms. Your nose started to run, you started to feel congested, your throat was sore, you started to feel achy all over and maybe sick to your stomach. You'd think you were dying. Oh no, what's happening to me? But then if you went to a doctor and he said, you know what? This is just a virus. It's normal. Everybody gets it when they, these are the symptoms they get when they get a virus. It's going to run its course. And if you go home and go to bed and drink lots of fluids and get some rest, in about 5 to 7 days, you're going to start to feel a lot better and you're going to be perfectly healthy again. That's what we're doing in that normalizing and self-care process. We're teaching them what you're going through is normal. This is how long approximately it's going to last. We even kind of predict for them, these are probably some of the things you're experiencing, and that's okay. And then we tell them how to take care of themselves over this period of time to know that they can help really bring along their healing. So it's really an educational process that you can almost see people calm down when you tell them, you're not crazy, you're not losing your mind, you're not going to die, and the truth is, it will get better. You may not feel like that right now, but can you trust me to know that I've seen other people go through it, and it won't hurt this bad forever.
Jennifer, I'm thinking as you're talking that literally we're giving them permission to join the human race. This is all part of our heritage as being humans. I'm thinking of 3 words as we wrap this up. Experiencing the experience, then gaining a new perspective, and finding new meaning, finding meaning through the process. And I tell my clients, look, it's happened. You've got that, sooner or later that reality has to be accepted with anything. It has happened. It has something to offer you, something good. It can actually be a gift. C.S. Lewis said that. Now, drain it dry. Get everything out of this experience that you can get. And the same would be true of loss in however it comes, and at whatever stage they are. I think that we as therapists can offer that hope, that something good. Your life is never going to be the same. I've told so many clients that it's never going to be the same again, but you know what? It can be good again.
Absolutely.
It can be good again. And really there can be like transformation. There can be a being reborn, and some people have literally described it, coming out of a traumatic experience or a crisis. It's like being reborn. And of course that would be our goal, wouldn't it be?
Absolutely, and that's a point that I definitely want us to make here in the end, is that it's very important as a helper, as a caregiver, whether you're a professional counselor, a lay counselor, pastor, if you're working with people who have had trauma or loss or grief, it's very important that you really yourself have a theology of suffering. And I know you agree with this, that we understand that though God doesn't necessarily visit suffering upon us or wish that upon us, that He allows suffering. And He will be faithful to use suffering in the lives of His children to bring them to a closer relationship with Him, to become more the people He wants us to be.
And that we were actually destined to be. He designed and had a purpose in mind for us, and all of this fits into a bigger picture than we can see. God has this big picture and it's already complete, and He just doesn't let us see the picture all at once.
It's been so wonderful to discuss this with you, and I just want to say that I know that you feel the same way, and that God has used us and will use all the people watching this video to bring about healing in people's lives after suffering and grief.